Do you ever get undertones or grunts or even squeaks when you try to articulate on the upper clarion notes? Something like this. Well, that's a very common issue, and of course the answer is in the how to play clarinet triangle, and in this video I'm going to tell you how to identify what's the problem and how to fix it. My name is Josh Gu, and after years of studying the clarinet with some of the best teachers from around the world, I am excited to be sharing my knowledge with you. So go to QuickStartClarinet.com or check the description on this video to see all of the wonderful resources I have to help you reach your clarinet dreams. And of course, subscribe to this channel for weekly clarinet and music tips and tricks. When you're playing in these upper registers, the most important thing is the reed vibrations and that you're getting enough energy into the reed to keep it vibrating. These higher frequency notes require more energy out of the reed, so if you're either not supplying that energy with your air or there's something else getting in the way of that, then you're gonna have problems. Luckily, our brains are really smart, and oftentimes we hear that little grunt or undertone at the beginning of the notes, and our brains almost immediately know what to do to fix it and get to the note that we want. That's why it doesn't just stay an undertone the whole time. We're basically fixing it really quickly in real time. So the trick is to know what the issue is gonna be before you start playing so that you can fix it or be in the right spot to begin with so that you don't start with the undertone. Now, the reason that I have the how to play clarinet triangle up here is because I really like to think about achieving these notes really well, and really all the notes on the instrument well, as sort of this kind of complex multi-layered matrix of different variables, and the main variables are the air, the embouchure, and the tongue, but within those there's some sort of sub-variables that you can adjust and manipulate as well to try and get your very best sound. And 90% of the time when there's an issue with the upper clarion notes articulating, or the altissimo notes, or really any notes, it comes down to something with those variables being off and not being in the right spot to get those notes to sound really good. The other 10% of the time, the issue is probably an equipment thing. If you have a little leak, if you have too soft of a reed, if you have too hard of a reed, if you have a bad mouthpiece, a bad clarinet, all kinds of other equipment things can cause issues there as well. Because to get those notes sounding really great and coming out really clearly at all dynamics, with all different articulations and note shapes, you have to have everything really just right. So in this video, I'm gonna assume that your equipment is just right and not worry about that too much, and talk about what we can do to make our equipment work. All right, so starting with the most important variable, the air, here are a few things that can sort of be an issue, or the things to watch out for with the air, sort of these sub-variables of air. I also grouped it with tongue position because so many of these things are affected by tongue position, and the position of the tongue is almost mainly to get the air in the right spot, moving the right way with the right pressure and all that stuff. So I think it's important to put those together. So let's look at what these variables actually mean. So the pressure of the air is sort of how strong the air is going at the reed. I really like to think of high pressure air all the time. I find that that helps so much with connections between notes, quality of sound, and of course this articulation in the upper clarion. So you want to think nice high pressure air. Most of these other variables sort of contribute to the pressure of the air. If you change the speed or the volume, then that's going to change the pressure as well. High pressure air is a pretty high volume of air moving at a pretty high speed. But for different people, thinking about these things in different ways is helpful. The temperature of the air actually is a really common way to sort of conceptualize the air. If you think about when you're sort of blowing on a piece of glass that, or glasses that you're trying to fog up, to clean off, and you sort of do that like, that's very warm air, but it's also very slow air. But usually it's a pretty high volume of air. If you're doing the opposite, where it's really cold air, as if you're trying to cool off a hot drink or soup or something like that, that sort of, that's a very cool temperature air, which is conversely very high speed, sometimes less volume, sometimes more volume. I think to get the best pressure, you sort of want a combination of both, where it's a large volume of air, a lot of air molecules moving, if you will, and moving them at a high speed. And that sort of gives the best high pressure clarinet airstream. So it's a lot of air moving very quickly. Now the other thing that plays a big role in pressure is kind of the direction and also the tongue position. If you have a lot of air moving very quickly, you can still do that pretty low pressure. That might sound something like this. So that was a ton of air that pretty much I emptied my entire lung capacity in just that short little span of time. And the reason why it went so fast was because there was low pressure, there was low resistance letting the air come out. That's where this tongue position comes in, and the embouchure a bit as well, which is to focus the air at the reed and give you that really sort of narrow passageway that the air is moving through. That's why we always talk about the sort of he tongue position, getting the back of the tongue nice and high, and also getting the tip of the tongue nice and close to the reed, so that you're really focusing the air into a really narrow, targeted, focused airstream with lots of speed, lots of volume, cool-ish temperature. Temperature is one that I actually don't think about all that much. Sometimes it's just helpful, but medium temperature, we'll say, and then that'll give you the air that we want. Very, very high pressure air to get the energy into the reed vibrating. Now the other thing here that we talked about a little bit is the direction. This kind of has to do with voicing as well. You can have really high pressure air, but if you're aiming it really low or even too high, then you'll get sort of a weird airstream. If it aims too low, it's sort of which doesn't really work for the clarinet. This is where voicing comes in, is the direction of the air. You've probably heard about voicing before, and that's why these upper clarion notes are so tricky, because they have to be voiced really properly. If I aim with high pressure air, but aim it really low, this is sort of the effect that you get. I'm blowing really strong air and really supporting, but it's not going into the reed the right way. So what you want for direction is pretty much parallel to the ground, with your head being straight up and down, perpendicular to the ground, with your body, air goes parallel to the ground, so that you're sort of going at this angle to the instrument with your airstream. The easiest way for me is to just think about like a bullseye out in front of me, and I'm trying to blow the air at my hand right in front of me. And that's the difference between really low air to really high air will actually get the notes to come out. So you could hear immediately, just by bringing the air up, aiming a little higher, it made the note come out really easily. So that's what's necessary with the air and the tongue position to get the notes to come out. What often happens is when we're starting notes, one of these variables will not be correct. Oftentimes it takes a while to get enough air moving fast enough at high enough pressure to get the notes actually started. So if you're starting with sort of a weak airstream, then that can cause undertones. A way that I like to work on this is to just start notes without tonguing and see if you can get the air like to the point that it needs, get the variables of the air dialed in right away without tonguing. That might sound something like this. And it's okay to accent a little bit if you're really trying to get the air going. Eventually, as you get more comfortable with that exercise, you can get the notes out just really square and smooth and nice like we like. The other things that could be happening also is that you're just not aiming in the right direction. You don't have the right voicing. And that all comes down to sort of hearing the note before you play it. You want to know where you're aiming. You want to know where that bullseye is, where it feels right to have that note to come out before you start, so that you don't have any scooping up. That's a good indication that you have an issue with the direction, is if you get these kinds of starts. You can hear how it's like a little miniature gliss up to the pitch because I'm starting too low and then subconsciously really quickly making that adjustment to get to the pitch that I actually want. Now moving on to the embouchure. This one also has some sub-variables to be thinking about, and these can all make a big difference when you're trying to articulate these higher notes. The embouchure is a little different than the air, because remember the end goal is to put enough energy into the reed to get it vibrating. Now the air, it's really obvious that like the higher pressure of the air, the more energy will be going into the reed. The embouchure is a little different. It doesn't help provide energy to the reed. Basically the point of the embouchure is to not take energy out of the reed. The problem with the embouchure is that sometimes you can have really good air, but the embouchure can absorb or pinch off all of the vibrations of the reed, no matter how much good energy you're putting into vibrating it. So the keys of the embouchure are just the general shape. I've talked about this a lot in different videos, and hopefully if you know anything about embouchure, the shape of the embouchure is the main thing to know. Thinking about the corners coming in, making it nice and round, flattening out the chin so that it's a nice solid surface for the reed to be vibrating against. If the lip is too squishy, that dampens the vibrations of the reed, and if it's too firm, then it pinches it off, and that has to do more with the pressure of the embouchure. So you want to make sure that you're putting just the right amount of pressure on the reed. The goal of the embouchure is to just bring the reed to the mouthpiece just a little bit so it can start vibrating, but it's very easy to overdo it and then be pinching off the vibrations of the reed, so then those notes don't come out. And then finally, the position is also very important. That has to do with actually where that bottom lip is making contact with the reed, and also sort of the angle of the contact with the reed. If it's too close to the tip or too far down or aiming this way or this way, then you might have issues. The goal of the embouchure should be to sort of push right into the heart of the reed, without even really pushing on the reed at all. I like to think of my jaw pushing forward so that if this is my lip, it's sort of going this way on the reed, never pushing up, never pushing straight into the reed. It sort of goes at a weird angle to it. It's not quite a 90-degree or 45-degree angle, but it's pushing down into the heart of the reed as the instrument's in your mouth. Now, the most common mistake with these embouchure things when getting those undertones on the upper clarion articulation is almost always a pressure issue. Sometimes a shape or position issue, of course, but most of the time it's a pressure issue. Often when we're trying to start a note, especially when we're a little scared about getting an undertone or getting a squeak and having those high notes blast out in a less nice way than we're hoping, we get a little tight and try to control it too much. And that's when the embouchure sort of clamps down, pinches off the vibrations of the reed, and then you don't get immediate vibrations. That might sound something like this. You can hear and probably tell that I'm pushing a lot of air in, but nothing's happening until I open up my embouchure a little bit. The other thing is when we actually tongue, it's really natural for our mouths to sort of close or our jaws to close up when we tongue, where the tongue comes to the reed, and then we sort of close down and get this sort of pwa, 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 pwa sort of effect. And when you start too tight like that and then open up, that's when you get that undertone of too much pressure, and then you let off the pressure and the reed's finally able to actually vibrate. The most common shape issue is just that the bottom lip's too squishy, so it's dampening the vibrations of the reed. That's when you get that really fuzzy undertone like this. And then the most common position issue is often that the clarinet's a little bit too into your body. I made a video about that recently, and that you're putting too much pressure near the tip of the reed. And it's not necessarily because you're squeezing or biting at all with your jaw, it's just the position of the reed in your mouth puts too much pressure. And that's when you get that really thin sound where nothing kind of comes out. And that brings us to our last set of variables, which are related to the actual tongue motion. So the main issue here, and this will particularly be an issue if your reed's a little bit on the softer side or the older side where it doesn't have enough springiness to it, is just how much pressure you're actually putting on the reed. It's very common for there to be way too much pressure on the tongue. I think a lot of times when we're learning, we're taught that tonguing is sort of hitting your tongue to the reed or yeah, hitting the reed with your tongue. And when you think about it in that sort of hitting context, it becomes a sort of smacking, hitting motion, and that's too much pressure for the reed. If you really are pushing into the reed or pushing off of the reed when you come away, then you're sort of bullying the reed to not vibrate and smashing it into the mouthpiece. All we want for the tongue pressure is just enough to stop the vibration and then just come straight away. I really like the analogy for tongue touching the reed to be the same as your fingers touching the keys. You have on the key and off the key. Those are your two positions. You go in between those two positions very, very quickly and with good snappiness, but you're never squeezing the instrument, you're never slapping your fingers on the instrument. It's a gentle motion between on the key, off the key. Same thing with the tongue. On the reed, off the reed. Now, the other issue is the amount that your tongue is moving. So remember we talked about the tongue position is really important to stay high with the tip close to the reed to power the air and focus the air. But oftentimes students will take their tongue off of the reed and get just a lot of momentum with that tongue coming off the reed and sort of do one of these where the tongue comes off and then just keeps coming off. And that's where you'll lose focus. And then of course the subconscious kicks in and hears that the note's not coming out and usually adjusts to the right tongue position pretty quickly to get the note out. So the goal is to not move too much and then adjust, it's just to move as much as needed. So those two things might sound like this. This is too much pressure sort of smacking the reed. It almost sounds like slap tonguing, and if your air is strong enough and your embouchure is not inhibiting the vibrations, you might actually get that really clear pop at the beginning, especially if your reed's not too soft. If your reed is too soft, it might just sort of do nothing. And sometimes I have students who you can hear, I'm not sure if the mic will pick this up, but you can hear the tongue come off the reed and then the note start like this. That's usually an issue of too much pressure. It also might be an issue of not actually having the air going before the tongue comes off the reed, but that's sort of separate. The amount of tongue motion, you may get that sort of thud at the beginning and then undertone and then the note comes into focus. And again, you might have that sort of scooping into the note like you get with the tongue position just being too low in general. And again, if your air's good and your embouchure is good, you may not even get an actual undertone, but it's still a very unappealing beginning to the notes. All right, I hope that you found that to be helpful, and I really encourage you to maybe go back through and really maybe even write down these variables so that you have those notes, because they're really what makes your sound in any case, whether it's low notes, high notes, slurred, staccato, legato, loud, soft, it all comes down to these variables and lining up the variables in the right spot. And if you can get those variables figured out and you can know consistently how to get the sound that you want by lining up those variables and placing them in the right spot, then you'll be well on your way to sounding great all the time when you play. Of course, it's easier said than done and takes lots and lots of practice, so really spend some time doing your long tones, and if you ever find yourself bored doing your long tones, think about this list of variables and consider, I wonder if I changed my embouchure position a little bit, or if I got my tongue a little closer to the reed, or put a little bit more energy and pressure into the air to get really good support, how might that change the sound? And feel free to experiment and see what it does and figure out what works best for your physiology, what works best for your setup so that you can play through the whole range of the instrument with the sound you want at all dynamics, all articulations, and all that fun stuff. So I hope that this has been helpful. Let me know in the comments below if you have any other questions about how any of this stuff works. I hope that this helps you to get those upper clarion notes articulating very well. If you have any suggestions for other videos, I'd love to hear those. And if you could please, please, please like this video, subscribe to the channel. The growth has been a little slow since passing 1,000 subscribers, which I've heard is sort of normal for the YouTube algorithm, where you sort of have to just keep proving that that you're a channel worth watching, and the best way to do that is for you to watch the videos, share these videos with other people who might be interested in it. And thank you so much for supporting the channel, watching this video, watching my content, and I look forward to seeing you in another video.